Jack Callahan's boots crunched softly over a bed of pine needles as he carried a box of firewood across the cabin porch. Late April sunlight filtered through the towering trees that circled the property like sentinels. From a distance, the log cabin he'd built with his own hands looked like a postcard. Warm wood, tall stone chimney, a wraparound porch with 2 rocking chairs. But for Jack, it was a place to quiet the noise, the kind no money could mute. "Daddy." "There's a bird with a red head. Come see?" 8-year-old Ellie leaned over the wooden railing, hair like golden hay blowing across her cheeks, her voice filled with wonder. Jack smiled, not because of the bird, but because she still found magic in things. He walked over, squinting toward the pine branches where a cardinal flitted. "That's a good sign," he said. "Red birds mean someone's looking out for us." Ellie looked up, serious. "Like Mommy?" His throat tightened the way it always did when she asked about her. "Yeah," he said softly. "Just like Mommy." Jack wasn't a man who talked much. He didn't have to. His presence spoke for him. Calm, capable, with eyes that had seen war, wealth, and widowhood, and now just wanted peace. He had made his first million before he turned 30, managing crisis logistics for corporations too big to fail. The irony never left him. He'd saved companies, but couldn't save the one thing that really mattered. Now the cabin, tucked deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, wasn't just a retreat. It was an attempt at repair. A quiet corner of the world where the stillness felt like medicine. He ruffled Ellie's hair. "How about a hike before lunch?" "Yes," she chirped, bolting inside to grab her little day pack and a notepad she used for sketching mushrooms and leaves. They set off down a moss-lined path behind the cabin. Ellie walked a few paces ahead, darting from tree to tree like a forest fairy. Jack followed with quiet attention, letting her lead but always keeping her within arm's reach. It wasn't long before he noticed it, an odd shift in the air. Not colder, not warmer. Just different, like a breath had been held too long. Then came the sound. So soft he almost didn't hear it. A voice, faint, frayed, floating on the wind like it wasn't sure if it wanted to be found. He stopped walking. "Ellie," his voice was gentle but firm. "Come back here, baby." She turned, sensing the change in his tone. She scampered back to him, eyes wide. "Stay right by my side, okay?" he said. "Don't wander, not for a second." She nodded and slipped her hand into his. He glanced around, scanning the trees. The sound didn't come again, until it did. "Help!" This time it was clearer, fragile, almost embarrassed to exist. He hesitated. There were no other cabins nearby, no hikers this deep in, and no one who would have mistaken this forest for a place to stage a prank. "Stay here," he said, "right by that log. I'll be 2 minutes. If I whistle, you answer, loud and clear." "Got it?" Ellie nodded, hugging her sketchbook to her chest. Jack moved slowly, deliberately, down a side path so overgrown it barely looked like a trail. The trees grew denser here, vines draping like curtains, roots coiling across the ground like sleeping snakes. And then he saw something, a flash of white. He stopped. Every hair on his neck rose, not out of fear, but recognition. The human brain knows what doesn't belong. A white dress in the woods did not belong. As he stepped closer, his eyes adjusted to the filtered light. There, beside a weathered split-rail fence that marked the end of the old property line, sat a woman. Her dress, once elegant, was now stained with soil and streaked with pine sap. She looked like she had stepped out of another life and into the wrong story. Her arms were wrapped around her knees. Her hair hung like a veil across her face. And when she looked up, Jack stopped breathing. Eyes swollen but alert, mouth trembling but closed. Fear, not of a stranger, but of being seen. He approached slowly, kneeling a few feet away. "You okay?" he asked softly. No answer. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Jack. My daughter's just back that way. We're staying at a cabin. You're safe now." The woman blinked. Her voice, when it finally came, cracked like dry wood. I didn't know where else to go." Her accent was soft Southern, educated, refined. She wasn't from here. Not from these mountains. Her hands shook as she reached up to brush hair from her face. There were faint marks on her wrists, like she'd been bound, but Jack didn't ask. "Not yet. What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Grace." "All right, Grace," he said, offering his hand without expectation. "Let's get you somewhere warm. My daughter, Ellie, she's kind. And I've got some coffee on the stove if that helps." Grace didn't take his hand, but she nodded. I'm not crazy," she said, barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to be married today." Jack said nothing. He let the silence hold her. "I left," she added. "I had to." Still, he didn't ask why. "Not here. Not like this." They walked back in silence, Jack always 2 steps behind, letting her move at her own pace. When they reached Ellie, the girl blinked in confusion. "Daddy? Is she a princess?" Jack smiled despite himself. "Kind of," he said. She just forgot her castle for a minute. Back at the cabin, Grace sat at the kitchen table while Ellie made her a drawing of a tree with a heart inside it. Jack poured hot coffee into a ceramic mug and slid it gently toward her. "Cream's on the counter." "Sugar's in the little blue jar." She nodded, wrapping her hands around the cup like it was a lifeline. "I'll only stay a day," she said. "Then I'll figure it out." "No rush," Jack said. "There's no deadline on getting back to yourself." She looked up at him then, really looked. And Jack, for the first time in a long time, felt something move in his chest. Not attraction, not desire, something quieter. Recognition. There were people who hid behind walls, and then there were people who had no choice but to build them. Grace hadn't just left a wedding. She had escaped a story someone else tried to write for her, and he wasn't about to ask her to explain it all in one breath. But he would make her tea if the coffee ran out. He would add more wood to the fire if the cabin got cold. He would answer the silence with stillness. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can offer a stranger is space. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. The cabin smelled of cinnamon and cedar. Jack had put a pot of tea on the stove after the coffee cooled. He wasn't sure why. Grace hadn't asked for it. But there was something about her silence that made him want to offer warmth in whatever form he could. Ellie sat cross-legged at the coffee table, humming while she colored, her crayon strokes soft and serious. Grace watched her from the kitchen chair, one leg curled beneath her, hands gripping the mug like she wasn't sure what else to hold. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the pines, casting long fingers of gold across the hardwood floor. Outside, birds chirped like nothing had changed. Inside, the air was careful. Jack stood at the sink, rinsing a pan from breakfast he never got around to scrubbing. He could feel her eyes on his back. Not fear, something quieter, a kind of scanning, as if she were trying to figure out what kind of man built a life in the middle of the woods and still made tea for strangers. "You built this place?" Her voice was hoarse, but steadier than earlier. He nodded, still facing the window. "After my wife passed, Needed something to do with my hands that didn't involve signing checks. Grace looked down. It's beautiful. Feels real. It is, he said, turning slowly. And you're safe here. No one comes up this way without meaning to. She gave the faintest nod, then glanced toward Ellie. She's kind. Too kind sometimes, he said with a half-smile. She tries to fix everything with art and cookies. Grace's lips twitched, a half-laugh caught in her throat. The world could use more of that. Jack dried his hands and walked over, pulling out the chair across from her. He didn't sit, just rested his hands on the back of it. I know you said just one day, he said carefully, but that doesn't mean you have to figure out your whole life in the next 24 hours. Grace's eyes met his. There it was again, that searching look. He didn't blink. She shifted slightly, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. You don't even know me. Doesn't mean I can't be decent. What if I'm lying? He let that land, then answered, quiet and even. Then I'll deal with that if I have to. But you don't look like someone who came all this way just to lie. Grace looked down, hair falling like a curtain over her face. She pushed it back absently. I wasn't supposed to run. Not the way I did. You ran from a wedding? He asked gently. She nodded once. Jack didn't ask more. Instead, he sat, slowly, giving her space. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, high and soft. He rose without a word, turned off the flame, and poured water into the pot, already steeping with lavender and chamomile. I was engaged, Grace said suddenly. Her words seemed to surprise even her. To a man from Charleston. His family, they're known. Old names, big houses. Money that's been passed down through more hands than anyone can count. Jack returned, setting the teapot between them. He didn't interrupt. I thought it was love. Or maybe I convinced myself it was. It's hard to tell the difference when someone says the right things and buys you the right dress. She paused, eyes distant. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being me. I was always dressed right, spoke the right way, smiled when told. And the day before the wedding, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. Ellie looked up from her drawing. I get that sometimes, she said softly, when I wear too much makeup for my dance recitals. I feel like a stranger in glitter. Grace smiled, real and small. Exactly. Jack watched the exchange, something tightening in his chest. Grace reached for the teapot and poured, her fingers steadier now. Leaving wasn't easy, she said, eyes on the steam. But staying felt like disappearing. Jack leaned back. You're here now. You don't have to disappear anymore. She met his eyes again, and for a moment, the room stilled. Then Ellie spoke. Can she stay for dinner? Grace blinked. I don't want to intrude. Not an intrusion, Jack cut in. It's just soup. And it's better with company. She hesitated. I make cornbread too, he added. Ellie clapped. Yes. Daddy's cornbread is like pillows made of sunshine. Grace laughed. A soft, sudden thing. And for the first time since she walked through his door, the weight around her shoulders seemed to loosen. Just a little. Joan later, while the soup simmered, Grace stood by the window, arms crossed as she watched the wind rustle the trees. Jack noticed how she didn't lean against the wall, how her posture was alert, not relaxed. The instincts of someone who wasn't used to safe places. He handed her a folded blanket. You don't have to use it, he said. But it's there. She nodded, accepting it without meeting his eyes. Do you miss it? She asked after a moment. What? Your other life. Before this. Jack thought about that. I miss pieces, he admitted, but most of it was noise and pressure. This, he looked around the room, is quiet, sometimes lonely, but honest. Grace nodded slowly. Honest sounds nice. They sat down to dinner together, the three of them. Ellie filled the silence with stories about a raccoon she once saw near the trash bins back home. Grace listened, genuinely, laughing in all the right places. When dinner ended, Ellie yawned big and leaned against Grace's arm. You smell like cinnamon and forest, she murmured. Grace's hand hovered in the air, uncertain, then settled gently on the girl's back. After Ellie went to bed, Jack and Grace sat outside on the porch. The stars came out in slow pulses, each one blinking like it had something to say. Grace held her tea, cupping it for warmth. I don't know where I go from here, she said softly. You don't have to figure it out tonight, Jack replied. Grace looked over at him, eyes glistening, not with tears, but with something unspoken. Do people ever really start over? She asked. Jack held her gaze. Not all at once, but maybe one quiet day at a time. A breeze passed between them, cool and clean, the kind that cleared the air without warning. Grace looked out into the trees. I don't know what happens next. Jack leaned back, elbows resting on the porch rail. Then we're in the same place, he said. But that's not always a bad thing. They didn't speak again for a long while. But something had shifted. Not enough to call it trust. Not yet. But something close enough to let the silence feel full, instead of empty. The next morning arrived on tiptoe. Fog drifted lazily through the trees like it had nowhere else to be, and the cabin was wrapped in a hush that made every sound feel personal. Grace stood barefoot on the porch, arms folded, Jack's old flannel shirt draped over her shoulders. It was too big, smelled faintly of cedar and soap, and somehow felt like armor. Her eyes scanned the tree line, not looking for danger exactly, but for the idea of it. Old habits didn't disappear with one safe night. Behind her inside, she could hear Ellie singing something soft about sunshine and pancakes. The comfort of it tightened her throat. Grace had grown up around silence, but not the peaceful kind. Hers had been filled with marble floors, footsteps that echoed like warnings, and expectations that coated every word spoken at the dinner table. You're up early. Jack's voice came from behind her, low and easy. She turned slightly. He was in jeans and a white t-shirt, his hair still damp from a shower. He held 2 mugs. Handed her one. I couldn't sleep, she admitted, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic. Me neither. They stood in quiet for a moment, sipping coffee, the porch groaning softly beneath their feet as the sun began to slip through the trees in fractured gold. Grace spoke without turning to him. I keep thinking about what happens when I leave, where I go, how I explain this. You don't owe anyone an explanation, Jack said, least of all to people who think you're just a character in their story. That hit harder than she expected. She looked down, biting her lip. It's not just them. I don't even know who I am outside of that life. I've been performing for so long I forgot where the script ends and I begin. Jack glanced at her, his gaze steady. You want a place to figure that out, this is it. She wanted to believe him, but belief, she'd learned, had a cost. Later that morning, while Ellie painted wildflowers on rocks outside, Grace helped Jack wash dishes. It was a quiet rhythm. Soap, rinse, dry. Nothing needed to be said. But Jack, sensing something heavy, broke the silence. You always been around Charleston? Grace nodded. Born and raised. My mother came from money. My father came from ambition. Together, they made expectations. Sounds heavy. It was curated, she said, placing a glass on the towel. I went to the right schools, wore the right clothes, dated the right people. Jack handed her a plate. And Nate was the right people? Her fingers froze. So he remembered the name she dropped. She looked at him sharply, but there was no judgment in his tone. Just quiet awareness. He was charming, she said, resuming the drying. His family knew mine. Our mothers played tennis together. He said all the right things. And when he proposed, it was in front of 200 people and 6 photographers. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And you said yes because saying no would have started a war I wasn't ready to fight. Jack nodded slowly. I get that, he said. I've said yes to things I didn't believe in, because it was easier than disappointing everyone else. That surprised her. Like what? Moving back here, he admitted. After Mira passed, people expected I'd disappear. Sell the business? Maybe move to Denver with my brother. But I stayed. Mostly to prove to everyone, and maybe myself, that I could still build something that didn't fall apart. Grace studied him. You still talk about her in the present tense. I guess I do, Jack said quietly. But not because I haven't let go. More because I still carry pieces of her. Not the grief, the good stuff. She looked away, her throat tightening again. She wasn't used to men who spoke about loss like it was sacred instead of something to run from. A knock at the door startled them both. Ellie outside looked up from her painted rocks. Jack moved to the door and opened it cautiously. A woman stood there, late 60s, white hair twisted into a loose bun, wearing a denim shirt and carrying a basket of something wrapped in cloth. Morning, Jack, she said, then peered around him. I heard from Barry that you were back up the hill. Thought I'd bring over some of my sweet rolls before they go stale. Jack smiled. Cora, you didn't have to. I know, but I'm nosy, and this gives me an excuse. She looked past him and saw Grace, who had stepped into view but stayed behind the counter. Grace straightened, almost instinctively. Cora's eyes narrowed, assessing, not unkindly. You must be the reason Jack finally put flowers on the porch, she said, her tone playful. Grace blinked. No, I didn't. She's just visiting, Jack said quickly. Cora stepped inside anyway and placed the basket on the table. You don't look like a threat, she said to Grace. But then again, neither do dandelions until they take over your whole garden. Grace tilted her head. That sounds like a compliment. Or a warning. Little of both, Cora said with a wink. Jack cleared his throat. Cora's a neighbor. Lives about a half-mile down. Nothing gets past her, so don't even try. I figured, Grace said, managing a real smile. Cora watched her a moment longer, then nodded. I'm guessing you've got your reasons for being up here. I won't ask. But if you need anything, vitamin C, warm socks, or a shoulder, you come to me. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but something caught in her throat. She nodded instead. I should go, Cora said. Storm's coming in tonight. Barometric pressure's been off all morning. She turned to Jack. Keep her safe. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. When the door closed behind her, Grace let out a long breath. She knew. She didn't, Jack said. But she trusts me. And she's someone worth having in your corner. Grace looked down at the sweet rolls. People like that are rare. He met her gaze. Yeah. But not as rare as people think. They just tend to live in places like this. The storm did come. just as Cora predicted. That night, thunder grumbled over the mountains like an old man telling stories to the sky. Grace sat in the window nook, blanket around her shoulders, watching the rain snake down the glass. Jack was across the room reading a weathered novel. He looked up and found her staring, not at the storm, but at him. "What?" She hesitated. "You said once that building things helped you feel whole again." "Yeah," he said. She shifted slightly. "What if I don't know how to build anything?" Jack set the book down. "Then maybe the first thing you build is yourself." Grace didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought mattered to me either way. The storm rolled out by morning, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and trees dripping with yesterday's memory. Grace stepped outside, the wooden porch cool beneath her bare feet. She inhaled the scent of wet earth and pine and let it sit in her lungs longer than necessary. She was still here, still safe. Still trying to believe that those three things could exist in the same sentence. Inside, Jack was making breakfast. She could hear the gentle clatter of pans, Ellie's soft humming from the hallway as she sorted through her collection of leaf drawings. Everything about this place felt suspended in a slower kind of time, like it refused to be rushed. Grace turned toward the edge of the woods. That's where it had all started. Her collapse, her shame, her last-minute escape from a life dressed in lace and suffocation. The wedding had been scheduled at a historic Charleston estate. Everything whitewashed, controlled, curated, just like she'd been. And yet, that man had called what they had a partnership. She almost laughed. "Morning," Jack said behind her, his voice a low break in the stillness. She turned. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee, offering her one with a look that didn't demand anything, just existed beside her. She took it. Their fingers brushed, barely, but the electricity was undeniable. She pulled her hand back too quickly, nearly spilling the drink. "Sorry," she murmured. He shook his head. "Don't be. Just wasn't ready." They stood in silence, facing the trees. "I used to think that if I stayed still too long I'd disappear," Grace said, staring into the mist. "My mother used to say women like us weren't made to rest. That stillness is where weakness grows." Jack looked at her. "She sounds tired." Grace blinked. She was, but in a polished magazine cover kind of way. "You ever tell her how wrong she was?" "No." Grace let out a breath. "She died 2 years ago. Cancer. I think it surprised her that something could take her body before her reputation." Jack stayed quiet. Let her talk. She was elegant, controlled. Always knew the right fork, the right wine, the right thing to say in a room full of people who hated each other quietly. He looked at her gently. "And you?" Grace met his eyes. "I was the understudy. Groomed to follow, until I didn't." Jack studied her face for a moment. "What changed?" he asked. Grace hesitated, eyes flicking to the tree line again. "I saw myself in the dress, the final fitting. Silk, hand-sewn lace, pearl buttons. It was everything a girl's supposed to want. But I looked at that mirror and thought, if I wear this, I'll vanish." She paused, swallowing. "And I want to be seen, not displayed, not owned. Just seen." Jack stepped closer, not invasive, just present. "You are." The words landed like warmth in a cold room. She didn't reply, just nodded slightly, her jaw tightening to hold in something unspoken. The front door creaked as Ellie poked her head out. "I made flower crowns." Jack turned, his smile returning like it had only been on pause. Grace knelt as Ellie skipped over, holding two mismatched wreaths, wildflowers, twigs, and what looked suspiciously like pipe cleaners. "I made this one for you," Ellie said to Grace, placing the crown gently on her head. "You look like a forest queen now." Grace laughed. The sound came easily, surprising even her. She touched the crown. "Thank you." "I've never been crowned anything before." Jack chuckled. "Better than being crowned Miss Cotillion Charleston." "Don't tempt fate," Grace said dryly, adjusting the crown. Ellie beamed. "Daddy said we can go to the old trail today. Want to come?" Grace hesitated. "It's just a walk," Jack added. "No pressure, but the overlook's pretty after the rain." Grace considered the idea of moving, of leaving the security of the cabin's walls. But something in her wanted to see the world from a new height. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's go." They packed a small basket, fruit, crackers, 2 canteens of water, and set off along a trail that wound through evergreens and birch trees, sunlight slipping through in quiet streaks. Ellie skipped ahead, her flower crown bouncing. As they climbed higher, Grace found herself walking beside Jack in a rhythm she hadn't intended. Her arm brushed his once, then twice. She didn't move away. At the overlook, they sat on a flat rock that jutted out like a balcony over the trees. The mountains rolled in waves of green and blue. "Worth it," Grace said softly. Jack passed her a canteen. "I come here when I need answers." "Find any?" "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly just silence." "But that's its own kind of answer." She turned to him. "You've been alone a long time." He nodded. "Long enough to know I don't need noise to feel full." "But—" He hesitated. "Some silences are nicer than others." Grace looked away, her voice quieter. "What if I don't know how to be what someone needs? I wasn't built for this kind of good." Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm not looking for someone to complete a picture. I just want someone to sit with me in it." Her breath hitched. No one had ever said it like that. Not with that kind of still honesty. Not with eyes that didn't expect her to change, only to stay. Ellie, sitting a few feet away, pointed suddenly. "Look, deer!" They turned. 2 young deer grazed near the tree line, cautious but unafraid. Grace watched them in silence, the moment pressing gently against her chest. On the walk back, the light shifted, softer, golden. The kind of light that made things feel more real. At the cabin, Grace paused before heading up the steps. "I've been waiting for someone to come after me," she said suddenly. A call, a car, a knock. Something to drag me back to that life. Jack stood beside her. "Do you want to go back?" She shook her head. "But I've never not belonged to someone. Not really." He studied her, quiet. "Well," he said gently, "maybe this is the season where you belong to yourself." She swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the doorknob, but she looked back at him before going inside. "Thank you." He didn't answer. Just held her gaze, long enough to say everything without saying a word. It started with the sound of gravel. Grace stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, hands submerged in warm, soapy water. Outside, birds chirped along the windowsill as if nothing could go wrong in a world where robins still sang after rain. But then the sound came again, tires crunching slowly over the winding road that led up to the cabin. Her hands stilled. Jack had gone into town earlier to pick up supplies and give Ellie a chance to visit the little bookstore she adored. They weren't due back for another hour. This wasn't them. Grace turned off the faucet and wiped her hands on a towel, heart thudding against her ribs with a rhythm she hadn't felt in days. It wasn't fear. Not yet. Just the weight of the unknown pressing against the quiet. She stepped onto the porch, keeping behind one of the support beams as the car came into view. A dark sedan, unfamiliar, idling just at the bottom of the driveway. A man stepped out. Tall, salt and pepper hair, sharp suit that looked like it belonged in courtrooms or boardrooms, not on a mountain. He wasn't looking at the house. He was placing something gently on the wooden gate that framed the start of the trail. An envelope, sealed. Then, without glancing around, he got back in the car and drove away. Grace didn't move until the sound of the engine faded completely. When she finally made her way down the path, heart in her throat, she saw the envelope leaned perfectly upright against the gate. Her name was written in ink she recognized immediately. Not the handwriting itself, but the style. Ornate, expensive, deliberate. Grace. No last name, no address, just her. She reached for it, then hesitated, hand trembling an inch away. A breeze passed through the trees, lifting the edge of the flap like a whisper. And against her better judgment, she picked it up. The paper was thick, almost theatrical. Inside a card, 2 sentences. You always looked better when you belonged to me. Let's not pretend you don't remember how that felt. No signature, but she didn't need one. Grace didn't cry. She didn't crumple. She simply folded the card, pressed it back into the envelope, and held it to her chest as if it might tell her what to feel. It didn't. When Jack returned, the groceries were half forgotten in the bed of his truck. Ellie dashed inside, clutching a new book with a fox on the cover. Jack was halfway to the porch when he saw Grace, still on the steps, hands in her lap, face unreadable. He slowed. "Everything all right?" She didn't look up. Someone came by. His expression shifted. "Who?" Grace handed him the envelope without a word. Jack read the card once, then again. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak right away. She finally looked at him. "It's starting." He exhaled slowly, carefully. "You think he sent someone?" "I know he did." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "All right, we'll figure this out." Her voice caught. "You keep saying that like I'm not the storm that just arrived at your doorstep." "Grace, I brought this here, to you, to Ellie. I didn't mean to, but now it's happening, and I don't know how to stop it." Jack stepped closer, kneeling so he was eye level. "You didn't bring anything here except yourself, and if someone out there thinks you're still his, he's wrong. But he doesn't think it." "He knows it. That's the difference. Nate Langford doesn't bluff." Jack's eyes searched hers. "You're not his. No one owns you." Grace shook her head. "That's not how people like him work. They don't have to make you sign anything. They just remind you what you owe them." Jack stood, pacing once. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded him he doesn't get to decide your story." Grace blinked. "You'd do that?" He stopped. "Of course I would." She paused, voice trembling. "Even if it makes your life harder?" He looked at her, eyes soft but certain. "I've lived through worse than hard, and protecting someone who matters, that's not hard. That's purpose." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For a long moment, they just stood there, surrounded by the hush of trees and 1,000 unspoken things. That evening, Jack pulled an old shoebox from the closet. Inside, a faded map of the property, some local contact cards, and a worn business card with embossed lettering. "Walt Thompson," he said, tapping the name with his finger. Retired judge. Lives a couple ridges over. We built his deck last summer. He knows people who still take justice seriously. Grace didn't respond right away. I know what you're thinking, Jack continued. You're thinking this makes it more real. That telling someone means you can't pretend it'll go away on its own. She met his gaze. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Jack leaned back. You don't have to decide tonight, but you're not alone anymore. And we're not going to wait for someone like Nate to make the next move. Grace stared at the card. The name printed in sharp black ink looked like a door she wasn't sure how to open. Ellie wandered in from her room, hugging a stuffed bunny. Are we okay? Grace smiled, crouching to Ellie's level. Yes, sweetheart. Just talking about adult stuff. Ellie looked at her carefully. Is that why your hands are shaking? Grace swallowed, then gently took Ellie's small hand in hers. Sometimes grown-ups get scared, too. Ellie leaned in and whispered, Then you can hold me like I'm holding you. Grace pulled her close, pressing her cheek into Ellie's hair, breathing her in. When Ellie had gone back to bed, Jack stood beside Grace in the hallway. You didn't ask for this, he said quietly. No, she whispered. But maybe I was supposed to walk through it. He nodded. And maybe I'm supposed to walk through it with you. She looked up at him, eyes wet but steady. Are you sure? Jack didn't answer right away. He just reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, then nodded once, without hesitation and without regret. The fog rolled in thick that morning, curling over the porch railing like it had secrets to keep. Grace sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, wrapped in one of Jack's old flannel blankets. She hadn't slept much, but that wasn't new. What was new was the heaviness in her chest that wasn't fear. It was something else, something that felt like consequence. Jack stepped outside, a steaming mug in one hand, a file folder in the other. He wore the same soft gray t-shirt from the day before, but this time his expression was less quiet and more focused, like someone who had made a decision overnight. He handed her the coffee first. She took it without a word. Then he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. He opened the folder on his lap and held out a photo. Grace looked down. It was Judge Walt Thompson, older than she expected. Round glasses, a kind face marked by age and years of making hard calls. Jack tapped the paper lightly. He's solid, retired but still sharp, respected around here. If there's anyone who can help you put a name to what's happening and how to fight it, it's him. Grace stared at the image. I don't even know what I'd say. You don't have to have the right words, just your truth. She closed her eyes for a long moment. You make it sound so simple. It's not, but it's possible. They sat in silence. Only the low rustle of leaves and the soft knock of branches against the cabin broke it. I'll go, she said finally, but only if you come with me. Jack didn't hesitate. Always. The drive to Walt's place was slow and quiet. Ellie stayed with Cora, delighted by the promise of warm cookies and stories about the time she rescued a goose from a rain barrel. Grace watched the trees pass like old friends she hadn't seen in years. Some of them looked familiar now. Others still felt like strangers. When they arrived, Walt was already waiting on the porch. He stood as they pulled up, cane in hand but posture straight. His house was modest, tucked against the hillside, with ivy creeping over the stone steps and wind chimes singing softly in the breeze. Jack, Walt greeted warmly, shaking his hand. Then he turned to Grace. And you must be the reason I've heard nothing but tension in his voice for the past 3 days. Grace blinked. Walt smiled gently. Don't worry. That's his way of caring. Jack cleared his throat. She's here because she needs a listener, and someone who knows how to navigate things that were never supposed to see the light. Walt's expression shifted, gravity settling into his features. Then let's go inside. I've got fresh mint tea and a couch that doesn't ask questions. The living room was filled with soft lamplight and the scent of lemon balm. Books lined every wall. Grace sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tight in her lap. Walt poured tea into mismatched mugs, then sat across from her, patient. Whenever you're ready. Grace stared down at her hands. Then up, then down again. Finally, she spoke. My name is Grace Whitmore. I was engaged to Nathaniel Langford. His family owns, well, almost everything worth naming in Charleston. They're old money, very old, and very good at making things disappear. Walt nodded once, silently inviting her to continue. It started subtly, small restrictions, public decisions that looked private. Friends fading, choices being made for me but presented like favors. She swallowed hard. The kind of control that looks like love, until you realize the only person being shaped is you. Jack sat beside her, steady. She drew strength from the way he didn't interrupt, didn't try to rescue, just stayed. I left the morning of the wedding, Grace continued. Ran. No plan, just instinct. I ended up here. I thought maybe if I was far enough away, I'd stop being someone's property. She pulled the envelope from her bag and handed it to Walt. He opened it, read the note, then looked at her. Did you keep any evidence? Messages, records? I deleted most of it. I didn't want to remember. But I have emails, a few voicemails, a contract that was never signed but heavily implied. Walt tapped his fingers together. Coercion under pressure of consequence. That can be a form of abuse, even if it's dressed in pearls. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. There's something else, she said more quietly now. There's someone in his family who helped me once. His cousin, Celeste. She warned me. Said if I ever ran to reach out. I haven't. I didn't want to drag her into it. She may already be in it, Walt said carefully. But you don't have to pull her. She can choose. Grace looked at him, tears lining her eyes. That's all I've ever wanted. A choice. Walt nodded. Then let's start giving you yours back. Later, in the truck, Grace sat with the window halfway down, the wind curling into her hair like it was trying to untangle the past. Jack drove one-handed, his other resting lightly on the steering wheel, silent as always. She turned to him. Thank you. For what? For not making me feel like I'm broken. He looked at her, expression unreadable. Then he said, so quietly, she almost missed it. You're not broken. You were just never allowed to be whole. That did it. The tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She turned quickly toward the window. Jack reached across, gently brushing it away with the back of his hand. No pressure, no assumption. Just presence. Grace covered his hand with hers. And in that quiet, just as the trees gave way to the clearing of the cabin, something between them shifted. Not a beginning, but the end of pretending it wasn't already happening. The garden began by accident. Grace had wandered to the edge of the backyard one morning, tea in hand, drawn by the soft hum of bees and the way sunlight spilled like honey across the patchy grass. There was an old raised bed out there, nearly forgotten, rimmed by a crooked wooden frame that had long since given up holding anything in. She crouched beside it, set her tea down on a flat stone, and reached into the earth. The soil was stubborn but not dry, like it had been waiting. She found mint first, wild and insistent, thriving where nothing else did. She pinched a leaf and held it to her nose, smiling faintly. Jack came out with a hammer and a handful of nails. "You're already planting?" Grace looked up, hand still in the dirt. "I thought I'd just clear a little space. It's easier to think when I'm doing something with my hands." He walked over, crouched beside her, and knocked on the corner of the wooden frame. "This thing's seen better days." "Kind of like me," she said without thinking. Jack's gaze flicked to her face, but he didn't offer sympathy. Just pulled a tape measure from his back pocket and started sizing the boards. "I'll cut some new planks. We'll rebuild it." Grace brushed dirt from her palms. "You always fix things?" He stood. "Not always. But I believe in giving things a second try when they've got good bones." She sat back on her heels, watching him walk toward the shed. That was the thing about Jack. He never forced a conversation. He just opened doors and let you walk through when you were ready. By noon, the garden bed had a new frame. Grace filled it with her own rhythm, slow and methodical. Ellie helped by placing painted rocks as row markers. "Rosemary here, Mama G," she'd say, already claiming Grace in a way that made her heart ache. That evening, they sat on the porch. Jack was sanding a piece of driftwood he found near the creek. Grace was thumbing through a seed catalog Cora had dropped off. She paused on a page with heirloom tomatoes. "Did you know some of these have been passed down for over 100 years? Jack didn't look up. "Kind of like people. Carrying roots they didn't choose." Grace set the catalog down. "You think that's what I'm doing?" He finally looked at her. "I think you're trying to figure out which roots to keep and which ones to leave buried." She didn't speak for a long time. "I got a message," she said finally. "From Celeste." Jack sat up straighter. "She said she's still working with the family's law firm, but from the inside, said she's watched them use people like currency. She tried to speak up once. Got sidelined so fast she almost lost her license." "What did she say in the message?" Grace pulled out her phone, opened a draft she hadn't sent. She offered to help, but quietly. Said she can't come out swinging. Not yet. But she can give us information, documents, things they've buried. Jack let out a slow breath. "You trust her?" "I did. Once." Grace's voice softened. "She was the only one who ever asked if I was happy. Not if I was settled or grateful. Just happy." Jack watched her for a beat. "Do you want to reconnect?" Grace's hands trembled slightly as she folded the paper catalog. "I want to know who I am when I'm not hiding." "I think she can help with that." He nodded, no hesitation. "Then let's talk to Walt again. See how this changes things." Before she could reply, Ellie burst through the front door with a sheet of paper clutched in her hands. "I drew our garden," she exclaimed, "with labels and everything, see?" Grace took the paper, tears pressing behind her eyes before she could stop them. "Tomatoes, rosemary, sunflowers," Ellie pointed, proud. "And I put hearts around the mint because that's the one you smiled at first." Grace swallowed. "You remembered that?" "Of course," Ellie said, shrugging. "You looked peaceful." Jack's eyes met Grace's over Ellie's head. "Peaceful," Grace repeated, almost like the word was foreign. Later that night, after Ellie had gone to bed, Grace sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, fingers hovering above the keyboard. She started typing. "Celeste, I'm ready to remember who I was before them. Tell me where to start." She hit send before she could change her mind. Jack came in a few minutes later, holding a tray with 2 mugs of tea and a small bowl of honey. He placed it gently between them. "Walt called while you were outside," he said. "Said he pulled some documents from the Langford archives through a contact. Land acquisitions, offshore partnerships. Stuff most people wouldn't catch unless they knew where to look." Grace leaned back in her chair, exhausted but buzzing. "It's starting to come apart. Or come together," Jack said. She looked at him. Really looked. "You're not just helping me, Jack. You're standing in the storm with me." He hesitated. "You think this is a storm?" "I know it is." He nodded slowly. "Then I guess I've decided you're worth getting soaked for." A single tear slid down her cheek. Not from sadness. From the relief of being believed. Grace reached across the table, fingers grazing his. "I don't know what this is yet," she whispered. "But I'm not afraid of it." Jack's hand turned, palm open. "I'll be here," he said simply. "Even when you are." She let her hand rest in his. And somewhere, deep inside her chest, a part of her that had been locked away for years, finally exhaled. The days that followed unfolded like pages from a book Grace never thought she'd be part of. The garden began to sprout in small, determined ways, sprigs of green pushing up through the soil, stubborn and hopeful. Ellie named each plant like it was a new friend. Jack added a simple bench near the rosemary, saying nothing, just quietly giving her space to sit when the weight in her chest got too loud. But it was what arrived 3 days later that shifted the tone. Grace found the package on the front porch just before dawn, a box no bigger than a shoebox, wrapped in pale blue paper. There was no return address, no note, just her name, handwritten neatly, in the kind of penmanship money teaches you. Jack found her standing there, staring down at it like it might breathe. "Did you order something?" he asked, gently stepping beside her. "No." They didn't speak for a long moment. Grace didn't touch it. Jack did. He peeled back the wrapping carefully, opening the lid like he was afraid of what he'd find. Inside, laid with surgical precision, was a wedding dress sash. Her sash. The one she'd picked out. Ivory silk with hand-stitched initials. She hadn't seen it since the final fitting. Beneath it, a note. Parchment paper. The same handwriting. "You forgot something. But I'll keep holding the rest until you come home." Grace's knees gave just slightly before she caught herself on the porch railing. Her breath came shallow. Controlled. Practiced. Jack stared at the note, then turned to her. "You okay?" She nodded, but her face betrayed the lie. "I never told him about the sash," she whispered. "I picked it alone." "It was supposed to be mine." Jack's voice was tight. "He's watching you." Grace didn't move. "Or someone is. Someone close enough to get to me without being seen." He tucked the note back into the box, closed the lid, and carried it inside. Grace followed, slower this time. They sat at the kitchen table in silence. The clock ticked. Ellie was still asleep. Grace finally spoke. "He's not going to stop." Jack didn't look at her. "Then neither will we." Grace's hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the box. "He's not threatening me the way people expect. There's no anger, no rage, just reminders. Tiny reminders that I was never mine to begin with." Jack met her eyes. "You're yours now." She blinked hard. "But if he can find me here..." Jack reached for her hand. "We'll talk to Walt. We loop in Celeste. You don't run this time. We make the story yours again." The phone buzzed on the counter. It was Celeste. Grace picked it up, speakerphone on. "Celeste? I got it," she said quickly. The document, a non-disclosure agreement tied to a clause in your prenup draft. It was never signed by you, but it's been filed. Quietly. Nate's trying to use it as proof that you broke an agreement by leaving. Grace's jaw clenched. An agreement I never agreed to. Exactly, Celeste said. It's leverage. Not legal, but dangerous in the court of public perception. Jack stepped closer. What do we do? I'm pulling every copy I can find. There's one in the family's private archive, locked room at their estate. I've got a reason to be there this weekend. I'll get in, scan it, and send it your way. Grace's voice was thin. That's a risk. Celeste was quiet. Then, so was watching you disappear and saying nothing. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Be ready. When that document surfaces, it's going to force your hand. Jack stepped in. We'll be ready. Celeste paused, her voice softening. Grace, when you left, you did something none of us ever had the courage to try. Don't doubt that. The call ended. Grace stood in the silence, staring at the floor. I feel like I'm unraveling and growing roots at the same time. Jack crossed the room, standing just behind her. That's how you know it's real. That night, after Ellie fell asleep with her head in Grace's lap, a book still open on her chest, Grace gently eased away and stepped outside. The air was cooler, laced with the scent of mint and damp pine. She found Jack at the edge of the porch, looking out at the woods. She joined him. I was thinking, he said, not turning. About what you said. About not being yours. She waited. You're not anyone's. But if ever, you decided to let someone walk beside you instead of ahead of you. He looked at her then. Eyes unreadable. Voice steady. I'd be honored to be that person. The words didn't explode. They landed like leaves. Quiet. Certain. Grace stepped closer. Close enough for their arms to touch. I don't know what this is yet, she whispered. But I want to keep walking. Jack turned to her fully now, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Then that's enough for me. She rested her head on his shoulder, not asking, just trusting. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was home. Grace had always believed silence was safe. Growing up, silence was obedience. In engagement, it was preservation. But now, standing at the edge of Jack's porch in the quiet dawn, she realized silence was also a choice. And for the first time, she didn't want it. She held her phone tight in her palm, the screen glowing with a new message from Celeste. I have it. We need to meet. Not over the phone. The weight of those words pressed against her chest as she turned to look through the kitchen window. Jack stood inside, sleeves rolled up, tending to the skillet like breakfast could solve things. He'd been trying to protect her peace, but they both knew peace wasn't a shield. It was a decision. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her softly. He turned toward her. You okay? She nodded. Celeste has the document. His brow furrowed. She safe? She didn't say much. Just that we need to meet. In person. She's heading to Asheville tonight. Says it's neutral ground. Quiet. She asked me to come. Jack set down the spatula, wiping his hands on a dish towel. You're going? Grace swallowed. I need to. If there's something in that document that could be twisted into making me look complicit, I have to see it. You're not going alone. She met his eyes. I wasn't planning to. They left Ellie with Cora, who didn't ask too many questions, just handed Grace a little cloth pouch filled with dried lavender and sage for steadiness. she said. The drive to Asheville was muted. The roads curled through ridges like quiet rivers. Grace sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breath slow and deliberate. Jack reached across the console and gently wrapped his fingers around hers. No words, just warmth. They met Celeste in a small cafe tucked behind an old bookstore on a cobbled side street. She was seated at a corner table, hair swept back, blazer creased, face composed, but Grace could see the tightness behind her eyes. She hadn't just retrieved a file. She'd crossed a line. Celeste stood as they approached. Grace. Grace embraced her. "Thank you for everything." Celeste pulled back. "I should have done it sooner." They sat. Celeste slid a slim folder across the table and exhaled. "This is the document they've been keeping in the estate's legal vault. It's not signed, but there's a forged digital stamp on one version, which they could use to confuse public records if this goes legal or public." Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. His hands. It was all there. Language so carefully crafted it made her skin crawl. Phrases like emotional partnership clauses and perceived reputational risk, terms designed to paint her as a liability if she ever withdrew. Jack leaned in. "This reads like a contract designed to trap her." "It is," Celeste said, "and it's illegal. But the damage isn't in a courtroom. It's in the press. If this leaks, they'll use it to rewrite the narrative. That Grace was unstable. That she broke a sacred trust. That she ran to cover up guilt." Grace closed the folder. "That's not going to happen," Jack said. Celeste lowered her voice. "They're preparing a media move. I heard Nate's team met with a PR firm. Their plan is to release a curated version of this, paired with a carefully timed statement, something vague but damning." Grace's lips parted in disbelief. "He wants to destroy me just enough to keep me from fighting back." Celeste nodded. "You have two choices. We go legal, now. File a motion with Judge Walt and freeze any attempts to publish this. Or," Grace looked up. Or we control the story first." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Meaning?" Celeste's gaze shifted between them. "Meaning Grace speaks. Her voice, her version, no spin. No apology." Grace leaned back, 1,000 memories crashing into her chest. The way her parents had told her never to make a scene. How Nate had praised her for being elegant in silence. How every time she had something real to say, she'd swallowed it to keep the room calm. Jack's voice broke through her spiral. "You don't have to decide now." But Grace was already shaking her head. "No, I do. I've been quiet for so long. I almost believed the lie they told about me." She looked at Celeste. "If I speak, it'll be because I'm done hiding, not to get ahead of them, but to get back to myself." Celeste smiled softly. "Then you'll be the first woman to ever leave the Langford orbit without disappearing." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "That's exactly what I want." On the drive back, Grace stared out the window, the mountains silhouetted against a peach-colored sky. Her reflection in the glass looked different. Not braver, but clearer. Jack's voice came low. "I've never met someone who scares powerful people just by telling the truth." She glanced at him. "Does that scare you?" He looked over, steady. "It moves me." The quiet between them deepened. Then Grace said, "I'm going to write it. My story. Not for the press, not yet, just for me. For Ellie, for whoever I used to be." Jack nodded. "I'll help you if you want." She smiled. "I know." As they pulled into the driveway, the porch light flicked on. Cora stood in the doorway, Ellie wrapped in a blanket at her side, sleep still in her eyes. Grace climbed out and knelt as Ellie ran to her. "Did you win?" Ellie asked softly. Grace pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I didn't win," she said. "But I showed up." And sometimes, Grace realized, that was more powerful than anything else. It started raining just before sunrise, not the kind of storm that demanded attention, but a soft, steady patter that wrapped the cabin in quiet. Grace stood at the window, her reflection barely visible in the gray light. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of mint tea, but the warmth hadn't reached her fingertips. Jack entered the room behind her, barefoot, shirt wrinkled from sleep. He didn't speak. He just walked over, stood beside her, and looked out at the same trees, the same fog, the same unknowable morning. "She's still asleep," he said softly, nodding toward Ellie's room. "I checked." Grace nodded. They stood there in silence for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I'm ready." Jack turned to her slowly. "To do what?" "To stop feeling like I'm hiding inside someone else's story, to take the next step, whatever that means." He studied her face. There was no fear in it now, only determination. A quiet steadiness that had taken weeks to surface, but it was there. Grace had been buried under silk and expectations for so long. But this version, barefaced, unbrushed hair, tea gone cold in her hand, this was the most whole she'd ever looked. Jack nodded once. Then, "Let's talk to Walt." Later that morning, they arrived at Judge Walt's cottage tucked into the far bend of the ridge. The house smelled like tobacco and fresh bread. Walt ushered them in with that signature slow nod that meant he'd already been expecting them. "I figured today would be the day," he said, pouring 3 cups of black coffee and sliding 2 across the table. Grace sat across from him, clutching the mug like it might answer all her questions. Jack sat to her right, a quiet anchor. Walt took his time. "I've been reviewing the documents Celeste sent. Your fiancé, or his team, is trying to play chess with a crooked board." Grace gave a humorless smile. "That sounds about right." "There's no legal grounds for holding you accountable," Walt continued, "but there's enough ambiguity in that forged document to create doubt in the public eye." Grace's voice was steady. "So how do we turn the light on before they get the chance to flip the switch?" Walt leaned back. "You tell your story. First, not with anger, not to burn bridges, but to claim what's always been yours, your voice." Grace looked down at her hands. "You think people will believe me?" "I don't care if they do," Walt said gently. "The point isn't to convince anyone, it's to reclaim yourself." Jack looked over at her, his voice low. "You don't owe them an explanation, but you do deserve the truth. Told your way." Grace inhaled deeply. "I've been writing, at night, since Asheville." Walt raised an eyebrow. "Not for press, just for me. But maybe now's the time to share it." "Before they try to decide who I was." Jack smiled, proud. "Then maybe you read it, out loud. To the people who matter, Walt, Celeste, a few trusted community voices, we film it. Simple. Real." Grace blinked. "You think that'll work?" Walt nodded. "It's not about working, it's about planting the flag." She exhaled, slow and sure. "Okay." 3 days later, the cabin was quiet. Ellie was with Cora for the afternoon. Celeste had arrived earlier and helped Grace pick a soft sweater and tie her hair back. No makeup. No staging, just a single camera on a tripod, the porch as her backdrop, the mountains behind her. Jack tested the mic twice. Grace stood nearby, fingers flexing at her sides, the wind tugging lightly at her sleeves. She turned to him. "What if my voice shakes?" He smiled. "Then let it. It's still your voice." She gave a small nod, then stepped into place. Jack pressed record and stepped back. Grace looked into the lens, not as a performance, not as a plea, just as herself. "My name is Grace Whitmore." And for a long time, I forgot who that was. Her voice caught slightly, but she didn't stop. I grew up in a world where silence was called grace and obedience was mistaken for love. I was taught that a woman's worth was in how well she fit into someone else's story. But I don't fit anymore. I don't want to. She looked down, then back up. I was engaged to a man who never raised his voice, never laid a hand on me, and still found 100 ways to make me disappear. I left. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted to find myself before I forgot I ever existed. Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. This isn't a statement of accusation. It's not revenge. It's reclamation. I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm just done destroying myself. A pause, a breath. I found a garden in the woods. A little girl who paints hearts on rocks. A man who shows up without needing to speak. I found people who reminded me that love doesn't look like control. It looks like choice. She nodded once. So this is mine. My voice. My story. And I'm not giving it up again. She stepped back from the camera. Jack stopped the recording but didn't speak. He walked over, took her hand in his and pulled her gently to his chest. Grace rested her head against him. Her shoulders trembled, but it wasn't from fear. It was the first exhale of someone who had finally spoken aloud. Inside the cabin, Celeste sat at the kitchen table with tears in her eyes, watching the playback. Outside, the rain began again. But this time, it felt like something new had begun to grow. The video went live on a Thursday morning. No fanfare. No headline splash. Just a simple upload to a quiet channel titled Grace Speaks. Jack had added a one-sentence caption. When the truth lives in silence too long, it forgets how to breathe. She remembered. And then they waited. Grace stayed in the garden most of that day, her hands buried in soil, pulling weeds she didn't care about just to give her nervous energy somewhere to go. Jack brought her lemonade around noon. She barely sipped it. By sunset, the video had been watched nearly 8,000 times. Comments rolled in, women from across the country, strangers who somehow knew her pain without needing the details. "You just told the story I was too afraid to admit was mine. I left too. I thought I was the only one. You are not alone." She didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside her softened. That night, after Ellie had gone to bed and the stars blinked lazily across the black sky, Grace stepped onto the porch and found Jack sitting on the swing, his feet resting on the rail, sipping from a chipped mug. She sat beside him, closer than usual. "It's out there," she whispered. He nodded. She turned to him, her voice quiet but clear. "You know what the worst part was? I spent so long trying to leave without making noise. I didn't want to look messy or angry. I just wanted to disappear clean." He looked at her. "But you didn't disappear." "No," she said. "I finally decided to exist." A beat passed. Then Jack spoke, softer than she'd ever heard him. "I'm proud of you." She leaned into his shoulder. Let herself feel it. Let herself receive it. And for the first time since she'd arrived, She didn't feel like a guest in someone else's life. She felt like she was home. The next morning, a letter arrived. No envelope this time. Just folded paper, slipped beneath the cabin's front door like a ghost of the past, sliding in unnoticed. Grace unfolded it slowly. Her hands were steady. The writing was unmistakable. Nate's. I saw your little video. Brave. Foolish. I don't blame you. I blame whoever convinced you this was power. We both know your strength comes from silence, not spectacle. Let me offer you a final olive branch. One conversation. Private. Just you and me. 1 hour and I'll disappear from your story forever. If not, well, you've seen what the world does with complicated women. Grace stared at the words. Then she folded the paper and handed it to Jack, who had already stepped into the room. She didn't have to say a word. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing rash. Instead, he stepped closer and took her hand. You don't have to respond. Grace looked down. But if I don't, he'll just keep reappearing. I need to close this myself. Jack didn't interrupt. I want to meet him, she said, her voice stronger now. Not alone. Not without you. Not without a plan, but I want to end it in my voice, on my terms. Jack's eyes searched hers. You sure? She nodded. He thinks I'm bluffing. He's betting I'll flinch. I won't. Celeste arrived that afternoon. Walt joined them later. The plan was quiet, legal, safe. The meeting would be held in a public space, an old library conference room in a neutral town. Cameras would record everything, but Nate wouldn't know that. Walt would be nearby with enough legal documentation to back Grace if Nate tried to leverage anything. I won't yell, Grace said, sitting on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap. I won't even accuse. I just want him to look me in the eye and hear me say that I don't belong to him. Not his story. Not his shame. Celeste watched her for a moment, then smiled. Then let's make sure he hears it loud and clear. Jack walked her out to the porch that evening. The air smelled like wet leaves and firewood. You don't have to protect me tomorrow, Grace said, her voice low. He turned to her. I'm not protecting you. She raised a brow. I'm standing beside you, he said. That's different. Her eyes shimmered. Whatever happens, she said, thank you for letting me fall apart and not rushing to sweep up the pieces. Jack smiled softly. I knew you'd build something better from them anyway. Grace leaned in, rested her forehead against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, strong and steady. And just like that, she wasn't waiting to be rescued anymore. She was ready to speak. To stand. To finish what she started. The room was colder than it should have been. Gray walls, a table polished to a dull shine. One small window overlooking an empty courtyard. The library's old conference room had been chosen precisely for its lack of character. Neutral, quiet, impossible to manipulate. Grace stood by the window, arms folded, eyes focused on nothing in particular. Jack sat nearby, watching her the way you watch a storm form. Silent, certain, steady. You don't have to speak if it turns sideways, he said quietly. I know. If he tries to rattle you, he won't, she interrupted, because I'm not glass anymore. He stood, walked to her side. You were never glass, Grace. You were light. He just wanted to bend it. She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Promise me something? Anything. After this, we go home. Not just to the cabin, to something real. Jack nodded, no hesitation. Yes, whatever that means to you. I'll be there. The door opened then, slowly. Walt stepped in first, giving Grace a slight nod of reassurance. Behind him, Celeste entered, tablet in hand, calm but alert. And finally, Nate. He walked in like nothing had changed. Perfectly pressed jacket, cool eyes, a practiced half-smile like he was walking into a fundraiser, not a reckoning. "Grace," he said with a warm, false familiarity, as if the last few months had been a temporary misunderstanding. She didn't speak. He took the seat across from her, folded his hands, looked around the room. "A bit stark, don't you think?" Still she said nothing. Jack didn't sit. He stood behind her chair, silent, unmoving. Nate looked at him, then back at Grace. "Is he necessary?" "He's not leaving," she replied evenly. A faint smirk touched Nate's lips. "Of course not." Celeste clicked a button on the tablet. Quietly, the camera in the corner began recording. Walt leaned back in his chair, observing like a referee who'd already read the final score. "I saw your video," Nate began. "Well edited, convincing." "It wasn't edited," Grace replied. "It was honest." He nodded slowly. "Honesty is a dangerous thing when you're emotional." Her jaw tensed, but she didn't blink. "You didn't ask me here to insult me," she said. "So say what you came to say." Nate leaned in. "You're not ready for what happens next. There's a way to quiet all this. To end it gracefully. Walk away. Leave the noise behind. No interviews. No statements. Just silence." Grace tilted her head slightly. "You're offering peace, on the condition that I disappear." "I'm offering you what you said you wanted all along. Stillness, safety." Her eyes didn't leave his. "Stillness is not the same as being silenced." Nate's smile faltered. Just for a second. She continued, her voice calm. "You never shouted, never cursed, but every word you gave me was built to shrink me. You called it love. It was control." "Grace, no." Her voice rose just slightly, firm now. "You don't get to rewrite this. Not here. Not today." He looked at Walt, then at Celeste, trying to calculate his next move. Grace leaned forward, soft but pointed. "You're not here because you want peace. You're here because, for the first time in your life, someone told your story before you could." Silence fell thick across the room. Jack placed a hand gently on the back of her chair. "Just a presence. Just a promise." Nate sat back, the mask cracking. "You think you've won," he said, "but this won't last. People like you flare, and then you fade." Grace smiled, slow and sure. "Then let me be the wildfire that makes something grow after." He stood abruptly, collected his jacket, straightened the cuffs like the room didn't matter. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "I used to regret staying," she said. "Not anymore." He left without another word. When the door closed behind him, Grace exhaled. Not shaky, not broken. Walt stood, crossed the room, and reached out to shake her hand. "You didn't just speak. You took your name back." Celeste smiled. That was strength, clean, unfiltered. Jack moved to stand in front of her, eyes searching hers. "You okay?" Grace nodded. "I am." They stepped outside into the chill of late afternoon. The clouds had parted, just enough to let through a narrow band of light. It stretched across the parking lot like a path. Grace looked up at him. "Can we go home now?" Jack reached for her hand. "Yeah, let's go home." And as they walked to the truck side by side, Grace didn't look back. She didn't need to. The cabin was still when they returned, wrapped in the kind of silence that didn't press, didn't judge, just waited. Grace stepped onto the porch first, her hand still in Jack's. The air smelled like fresh earth and something sweet. Lavender, maybe. She stopped at the top step, listening. It was the first time in weeks she wasn't waiting for the silence to be broken by something unwanted. Inside, Ellie's laughter rang out from the kitchen. Cora stood at the stove, stirring something in a heavy pot, while Ellie danced barefoot across the hardwood, wearing one of Jack's oversized flannels as a cape. "We're superheroes today," she announced. "Cora made magic stew, and I defeated the dust bunnies under the couch." Grace smiled, her eyes soft. "Sounds like we missed quite the adventure." Ellie ran to her, arms outstretched, and Grace knelt, catching her with a gentle squeeze. The girl's warmth grounded her like nothing else could. Cora gave her a look, curious, kind. "You all right?" Grace stood, brushing a hand down Ellie's hair. "More than all right." Cora nodded slowly, like she'd already sensed the shift. "Then let's eat. I made enough to feed forgiveness and hope." Dinner was quiet in the best way. Bowls passed, bread torn, no one rushing. Grace didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. Her presence had changed. Lighter, anchored. After Ellie went to bed, Grace stepped onto the back porch with a worn blanket draped over her shoulders. Jack joined her minutes later, hands tucked in his pockets, eyes reflecting the stars overhead. "She didn't ask what happened," Grace said softly. "Not once." "She didn't need to," Jack replied. "She knew you'd tell her when it mattered." Grace looked down at her hands. "Do you think I'll always carry it? The weight of what almost was?" Jack leaned against the railing. "I think you'll always remember, but remembering and carrying aren't the same." She sat on the porch swing, pulling the blanket tighter. "I want to plant something tomorrow. Something permanent, not just vegetables or herbs. Something that stays." He looked over, the corner of his mouth lifting. "A tree?" Grace nodded. "Maybe an apple tree. Something Ellie can pick from someday and remember what healing tasted like." Jack crossed the porch and sat beside her. "You've changed this place." She turned to him. "What do you mean?" "When I built it, it was just a place to be alone. A shell. Now it breathes differently. Feels full." She looked at him, emotion catching in her throat. "I didn't mean to take up so much space." "You didn't take," he said, turning toward her. "You grew roots." Her eyes glistened in the low light. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in linen. She blinked. "What's that?" He handed it to her, slowly, like it mattered. She unwrapped it. Inside was a bracelet, simple but meaningful, woven with tiny strips of the old ribbon from her wedding dress sash, interlaced with strands of dried mint and soft thread the color of morning fog. Her breath caught. "You saved it?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. Jack nodded. "I didn't know why at the time, but I thought maybe you'd want to turn something painful into something permanent." Grace pressed her fingers to the bracelet. "It's beautiful." He smiled. "It's you." She looked at him. Really looked. Then, without thinking, without needing to prepare, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. And he let her. They stayed there, the night holding them gently. After a while, Grace whispered, "I don't know what comes next." Jack pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "Then we build it. Slow. True. Together." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but the unfamiliar sensation of being steady. "I'd like that." They sat in silence, stars turning overhead like they always had. Only now, Grace noticed their movement. She hadn't just survived, she'd returned. To herself, to her voice, to a life that wasn't perfect, but finally belonged to her. And tomorrow, she would plant something that would outlast everything they'd left behind. The soil was soft from last night's rain. Grace knelt beside the small clearing just past the garden, the edges of her sweater sleeves pushed up, hair braided and falling gently down her back. The air smelled like damp earth and blooming rosemary. Behind her, Ellie was humming, tracing circles in the dirt with a small stick, her boots too big and muddy with joy. Jack stood nearby, holding the young apple tree by its root ball, its branches thin but reaching. "You sure this is the spot?" Grace looked up, squinting against the morning sun. "Right here," she said. "It gets enough light and it feels like the place." Jack nodded, then slowly lowered the tree into the hole she'd dug. He didn't say much. He never did, when the moment felt like it was breathing on its own. Grace sat back on her heels and took a breath. She reached for the watering can Ellie had filled earlier and poured it slowly at the base of the tree, letting the water sink deep. "There," she said quietly. "That's where it begins." Ellie clapped her hands once, then stepped closer. "What kind of apples will it make?" "Sweet ones," Grace replied. "The kind that take their time." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, and watched as the morning light filtered through the young leaves, casting delicate shadows across the ground. For the first time in years, she wasn't focused on escape. She was building. Planting wasn't about the present. It was a promise to the future. Jack came up beside her. "You gonna name it?" Grace turned her head toward him, smiling. "Do people name trees?" "Some do." She thought for a second. "Hope." He nodded. "Fitting." Cora arrived a little after noon, carrying a basket of cinnamon rolls and wrapped bundles of seed packets. She hugged Grace like it had been years since they'd seen each other, not days. "I brought something to tuck into the roots," Cora said, handing Grace a folded piece of parchment paper. Grace opened it carefully. It was a short note written in Cora's careful handwriting. "To what grows after. Let it be free." Grace pressed her lips together and nodded, folding it again and placing it at the base of the tree before tucking more soil around it. They didn't speak for a moment. Just stood in the stillness, watching the tree sway gently in the breeze, like it was already learning how to dance. That evening, the cabin was filled with soft laughter and the smell of warm cider. Ellie curled up under a quilt, half asleep, with Cora beside her, telling a story about a fox who once tricked a mountain into singing. Grace stepped outside for a breath. The porch light cast a soft glow across the gravel path, and the trees beyond were silent, listening. Jack joined her a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs. He handed her one without a word. She took a sip, then looked at him. "You ever think about what happens after the storm ends?" Jack glanced out toward the dark horizon. "Yeah. You check for damage. Then you build." Grace leaned against the railing, her voice quiet. "I used to think peace would be the absence of everything. No fear, no noise, no people. But it's not. What is it then?" She turned to him. "Peace is choosing what you let in. What you grow." Jack looked at her with something warm and steady. "And what are you growing now?" She smiled. "Something with roots." He stepped closer, brushing a curl from her cheek. "You're not the same woman I found in the woods." "I know," she said. "I've been shedding her slowly, bit by bit." Jack tilted his head. "I liked her too." Grace's breath hitched, just slightly. "Even when I was lost?" "Especially then," he said, "because you never stopped trying to find yourself." She looked at him then, her eyes holding nothing back. "I've spent so long running from things. Now all I want is to run toward something. He set his mug down and took her hand. Then run toward me. The air between them held its breath. Then she closed the space, resting her head gently against his chest. I'm not afraid of starting anymore, she whispered. Jack wrapped his arms around her, holding her like a vow. Good, he said, because we're already halfway there. And above them the stars blinked in quiet agreement. The morning was still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from emptiness, but the kind that arrives after something sacred has settled. The kind of stillness that only comes once you've earned it. Grace stood barefoot in the grass, the hem of her dress brushing the tops of her feet. It was simple, cream linen, soft, weightless, chosen not for tradition or expectation, but for how it made her feel. Light, present, free. The tree they had planted stood taller now, just enough. Its leaves caught the sunlight like they'd always belonged to this land. Beneath it, Ellie had placed 3 stones painted in her favorite colors, turquoise, violet, and sunflower yellow, each with a word scrawled in shaky handwriting. Grow. Brave. Stay. A soft breeze picked up, lifting Grace's veil slightly, and she turned at the sound of footsteps. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, wearing a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, no tie. His sleeves rolled to his elbows, collar open. His hands were tucked into his pockets. But his eyes were steady, locked on her like she was the only thing he wanted to look at for the rest of his life. She smiled, slow and sure. You came, she teased gently. He stepped closer. You didn't leave me much choice. You saying you felt trapped? He reached her, brushed a hand down her arm. I'm saying I've never been more willing. Cora and Walt stood nearby, not as guests, but as witnesses. Not of a wedding in the traditional sense, but of a beginning. Something rooted. Something chosen. Ellie stood between them, wearing a flower crown, her arms full of lavender. Grace took Jack's hand, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Walt, holding a leather-bound notebook, cleared his throat. Well, y'all know I'm no preacher, but I reckon what I see here doesn't need much explaining. Everyone chuckled lightly, but the air was thick with emotion, the kind that didn't need applause or decoration. Marriage, Walt said, ain't just vows and rings and ceremony. It's choosing. Every day, especially on the days when choosing feels harder than leaving. It's showing up when it's easier not to. It's sharing silence and knowing what it means. Grace glanced at Jack. Walt continued. Today ain't about where you've been. It's about what you're planting now. Something to grow into. Something that holds. He looked to Jack. You got words? Jack turned to Grace, his hand brushing hers. I don't have a speech, he said. Just a promise. Grace nodded, eyes shining. I promise to meet you where you are, Jack said, voice low and certain. Not where you think you're supposed to be. I promise to stand beside you, not in front. I promise to hold space when you need silence, and to hold your hand when you want strength. She swallowed hard. And I promise, he added, to never make you feel like you have to be smaller to be loved. Grace's breath caught. Then Walt looked at her. Your turn, if you've got one. She took a shaky step forward. I don't have fancy words, she said, her voice breaking a little. But I have truth. She looked up at Jack. I promise to stay present, not perfect. To build something with you that's real, not glossy, not made for photos. Just for us. Jack blinked slowly, but said nothing. His hand tightened gently around hers. I promise, she whispered. To never let fear be louder than love again. Silence held for a long moment. Then Walt, smiling now, closed his notebook. Well then, by the power vested in me as a retired man who's built more decks than I've officiated weddings, I now pronounce you partners, planters, and people who get to kiss if they want. Laughter broke through the emotion, soft and sweet. Jack leaned in, brushing his lips against hers, and the world went quiet again. But this time, with joy. Ellie clapped, running forward to throw lavender petals at their feet, shouting, "You're a team now!" Grace laughed, scooping her up, and they twirled together beneath the tree. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the clearing. Cora laid out a blanket near the garden, unpacking bread and cheese and lemonade like it was a Sunday picnic. Grace sat beside Jack under the tree. Ellie curled up with her head in Grace's lap, half asleep from the day. The wind whispered through the leaves, soft and familiar. Jack looked over at her, eyes soft. "You ever think this was possible? Back then?" Grace smiled. "No," she said. "Not back then." She looked out at the trees. "But maybe the hardest things we live through are just the ground for what comes next." Jack took her hand again, the bracelet she wore catching the light. Woven ribbon, dried mint, thread the color of morning fog. Not just a memory, a transformation. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "I'm glad I finally knew how," she whispered. The stars began to rise, one by one. No ceremony, no grand finale, just a quiet ending to a long journey home. A beginning wrapped in roots, resting beneath a tree named Hope. And above it all, the promise. You can start again. You can grow again. And this time, you can stay. If you enjoyed this video, comment 1 to let me know. If not, comment 2. Your thought matters to me either way.